All right, Tim, you're up.
All right, let's see if we can get
Damn it.
going here. So, let's see. So we've been looking through Hebrews, obviously, and the first three chapters of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews has been establishing a very convincing argument that Christ is superior to the angels, he's superior to Moses, he's superior to the law, and then he's also our high priest. And if you look back at the ancient Israelites, there was a hierarchy of importance to their religion. And that was the big reason why the writer of Hebrews was pointing out now that Christ was superior to these particular aspects of their religion and their belief system. And so as we get into chapter 4, it's the argument will be building on Christ's superiority and how it relates to God's rest, and that his rest is better. So I asked myself a question at this point: why would the writer need to point this out? And what is the message here? Why does he need to bring in this concept of rest at this point? So the next question came to my mind is, what is rest? And I'm going to go back to what I used to do and show a slide real quick. If I can. Share screen, share screen, share screen. There it is. Just one slide today, guys, so I won't bore you with my slides. Okay. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So in Hebrews 4, there's three types of rest. And in the first, I broke it out into verses, and the word in quotes there is the Greek word, and this is the Septuagint definition of that word. So in verses 1, 3, 5, 10, and 11, I'm not going to butcher the word there, but it's the heavenly blessedness in which God dwells, and of which he has promised to make persevering believers in Christ partakers after the toils and trials of life on the earth are ended. And as we go through chapter 4, you're going to see how this interrelates these different meanings of rest. And we have in verses 8 and 4, once again, there's the Greek word, katapao, and it's to make quiet, cease, to still, restrain, or lead to a quiet place. What I found very interesting is the next one is verse 9, and that is the Greek word sabbatismos, which is, of course, the root word for Sabbath. And that is what this whole rest concept actually rests upon. This word sabbatismos is the crux of pretty much the entire chapter. And it's the heavenly blessedness in which God dwells, the promise to Christians to exit with Christ away from earth. And that's what we're looking towards. That's what we're hoping for. That's what we have our faith and belief in. And that is what the writer is really pointing towards when all the comparative rests are taken into account. And then I do have the comparative rests here. So these are the rests that are compared in chapter 4. So God's rest, the Sabbath rest, which is spoken about in Genesis 2:2, the rest associated with the promised land as the Israelites left Canaan, or as they left the desert and they were promised Canaan after 40 years of wandering. And then the believer's rest, which is present in Christ, the overcomer's rest, once again present in his victory, and then the future eternal rest. Any questions before we move on? Is everybody rested?
Fully rested.
All right. Let's go back to here. So before we get into the actual scripture, I wanted to take a look at what the Sabbath is, or in the Hebrew, it's Shabbat. And I'm going to try to figure out what is the Sabbath, why it's important to the Jews, what is Sabbath rest, and how the Jews view Sabbath. So if we could start off in Genesis 2:1-3, if someone could read that for me. And then we're going to be going over to Exodus 20.
I can read it.
I've got
Oh, go ahead, John. Go for it.
Genesis 2, 1 through 3.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he hath made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made.
So here's the first reference to rest and the Sabbath in the Bible, and God, he did his rest, he did his work, and then he took a rest, and then he not only took that rest on the seventh day, but he sanctified it. He made that day holy, and this was a demonstration to his people for a model of living. And it was preparing a path that eventually leads to Christ, and we'll get into that. But we have to keep in mind that this was the model that God wanted his people to live by. 6 days of work, the seventh day to rest and to look back at that work and to prepare for the next 6 days, and then that seventh day. So why did God create the Sabbath? And what was the penalty for violating the Sabbath? So if we could go to Exodus 31, 12 through, I think, 17. John, if you want to read that. The other John.
Got it. 31:12 through 17, you said?
I think that'll work. Yes.
All right.
Oh,
And
wait,
the
wait,
Lord
wait,
spoke to...
wait. Stop. Excuse me. Exodus 20, 8 through 11. I'm jumping the gun here. So this is the biblical definition of the Sabbath.
Gotcha. 8 through 11.
Exodus 28 through 11, yes.
Okay. Exodus 20, right? Not 28. Just making
Exodus
sure.
20.
Okay.
20,
okay.
colon, 8 through 11.
8 through 11. I wasn't 100% sure that's what I heard. Okay.
That's okay.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Thank you. So God just told me to enunciate better and to slow down my speech and rest in my speech. So I'm going to do that. So one more short look at Exodus. Now it's Exodus 31, colon, 12 through 17, if someone could read that. So this is the why God created the Sabbath and the penalty for violating the Sabbath.
Okay, 12. You said Exodus 31, 12?
Yeah, through 17.
Through 17. Okay. And the Lord's, oops, I'm in the wrong version here. Sorry. Change it. Okay. So 12. Okay. There's 12. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak also to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths shall keep you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on that person shall be cut off from among its people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed.
So what Charlie just read there is interesting to me because there's a lot of repetition of the same message, and if I was reading that, I would get the impression that whoever wrote this or whoever inspired it really wanted to drive home rest equals Sabbath. It's holy, it's sanctified. If you break this, you're to be stoned. So there's a severe punishment for breaking the Sabbath, and we all know that the Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments. And the two main reasons for the Sabbath, as we keep looking at this, is to remember God's creation, and then also, again, with the ancient Israelites, as they progressed in their history, is to look back being released from bondage, which will play an important aspect when we bring Christ into this. So, once again, Jewish Sabbath traditions and beliefs. It starts at sundown on Friday and lasts to sundown on Saturday. When I was studying for this, I found out that the Sabbath, it's highly encouraged that people eat together as a family. And that message was stressed over and over, that eating with family is to be enjoyed, is to be to tell stories, talk about Torah, to sing psalms, to recite the Old Testament, especially verses from Isaiah. Some of the other encouraged activities was walking, visiting with friends and family. So there's this whole concept of bringing together people and remembering the Lord God, and to just enjoy the rest that comes with family and friends. So in Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was. Go ahead.
Before we move on, can I point something out that I think is interesting in verse 13? Mm-hmm. It says, "Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep," and that word Sabbath there is plural. So I just like that, because I think that God's pointing out that there's more than one type of rest that he has. And I know that if we were to have read more of the laws, there was more than one type of Sabbath. There was not just the seventh day, but then there was the seventh year for the land. And I can't remember, there was the year of Jubilee.
Jubilee.
That's not a Sabbath though, is it?
So you're jumping ahead on me here, John.
All right. I'm just pointing out the plurality of it.
No,
and I'll be quiet.
You're exactly right. And so what John is referring to is, so we have the Sabbath, which is every seventh day, which was traditionally on a Saturday for the Jewish people. But then you have what's called High Sabbath or High Shabbat, and those are the festivals. And those would be the 7 main festivals: Passover, First Fruits, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Trumpets, and so on. And then you do have Jubilee, which would be considered once again a high Sabbath. So you're exactly right. You have that; those would be plural.
So I think this is cool. I just wanted to point out that the fact that that God's plan was multiple types of rest, and the Jews, they got focused on this one and ignored the others.
Exactly.
And we can talk about, and I'm sure maybe we're talking about that later, but I just think that's cool that they caught the part that Moses was repeating: don't work on the seventh day, but then they missed a whole bunch of the other stuff that he was talking about.
Well, let's talk about that, because it's important. We're all aware that how they really stressed and overstressed the Mosaic Law and took it to the nth degree. And we see in the New Testament how Christ kind of tore that down and reoriented the way they think. So sure, talk about it, John. Anything to add?
I just think that this is incredible, that as you mentioned, the plan was about rest and not about the rules, but it was about rest, right? God's plan for rest, and he had multiple plans for rest for man. And yet what man did is they took that and actually made rest work, which is kind of funny that we can do that. but they actually made so many rules on this idea of Sabbath that it was work. I mean, you couldn't do so many things you had to be super careful of, right? You couldn't spit in the ground because if it made that line in the dirt, then you were working. I mean, you just had to be super careful. And I just think that that's funny because that's that's what we do in our own strength and in our own plans is even when we see an opportunity to bless somebody, we got to make it even more work and make it hard and missing the whole point of what God's plan was here. And I really like the fact that he says, you shall keep it holy, and everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. And I like the fact that God says this because he doesn't, the point that he's making out is that this is a special day. This is a holy day. It's not as much about the details of what you're doing on that day, more about the whole idea and the concept that you should set this whole day should be set apart for rest. And I would contend that although we do not follow the Sabbath now in the manner that the Jews do, it is a holy day for us. We do it on a different day, but it's set apart and it is different. We go to church, we do these different things. Um, Hopefully it is restful. And we could discuss that. Maybe not everybody finds that day restful and not everybody sets it apart, but I like this whole idea. And now I'm just rambling, so I'll be quiet. Anybody have any other thoughts?
The thing that I look at is when I was working at a real job before I became a missionary, I as a manager, you would say you can't go near that. Well, you have to then define the word near. And that's what the Jews did. They had to define for me the word work. What does that mean? And so that's why they came up with all these rules is you can't walk further than 3/10 of a mile and you can't do this and you can't do that. You know, it's all of those things that, and really what God is saying here, keeping it holy, which is the part that John was saying that the Jews missed, is the keeping it holy is where's your heart? What are you thinking about? Like you said, a lot of people go to church. Well, I got to go to church Sunday and, you know, I have to do this and I have to do that, but our heart's not there, you know, and that's really what God's looking for is where your heart is. So I think that's where a lot of people miss the word rest is resting in the Lord and being closer to him than anything else. So I think we too look at the rules of what does it mean to work? You know, when Israel, you can't, when you get on an elevator, it stops at every floor because you don't have to, on Saturdays, stops at every floor because you can't push the button because that's considered work. And that's just how things are in our world is give me a definition of what do you mean by work?
So
I think, oh, go ahead.
no.
I was just going to point out, I think we misunderstand the whole concept of rest here too, because we're thinking rest means no physical
Right.
movement, but that doesn't necessarily have to be what rest is. Rest is refreshing, and you can still be physically working out and doing lots of physical work while at the same time you're being renewed and being refreshed. I love going on walks, right? If I go on a 3-4 mile walk, that's not work, that's refreshing for me. I enjoy that. But this whole concept of rest, I'm not sure that people quite understand it because you could be totally what's the word I'm looking for? You could be not physically in doing manual labor, but at the same time somebody is I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but anyways, you're not being restful because you're under somebody else's dominion or that you're being pushed down and oppressed. That's the word I was looking for. You're being oppressed, and it's not restful because you're being oppressed, even though you're not physically working.
Right. And so you got what you guys have just described is basically everything from verses 1 through 11. So we're done. We're finished. Right? But I was going to bring up, and John and Sean started to get into that, some of the interesting ways the Jews of the past and actually the Jews of today view the Sabbath. And one of the things that Sean brought up was interesting about the elevators. I was on an elevator once on Saturday in New York, and the gentleman in front of me was right close to the button panel. And I got in, and he didn't press anything. And I'm standing there at the back, and I'm looking at him. It's like, you're not more than 6 inches from that panel. Press a button, for crying out loud. And then I looked at him, and I could tell he was a Jewish man. And it dawned on me, he's not going to press that button. So I reached over and I pressed the button. But another thing that
I would have
John brought
started
up-
talking the gospel.
Yeah. So,
That's funny.
another thing, John brought up some scripture about spitting on the ground, and there's, and I'm blanking on what passage it is, but when Christ cured one of the blind man, he spat in the mud and then rubbed the mud. And you're asking, why in the world would Christ do that? Well, there's a reason, because he was kind of thumbing his nose at the Jews because it was on the Sabbath, and spitting in the mud or spitting in the dirt makes mud. So, but you could spit on a rock on the same day. So you see, it's, what is work? If I spit in the dirt, it makes mud. But if I spit on the rock, it doesn't make mud. So I'm not working. And just
So the man had to wash the mud off. Which is
Exactly.
work.
yeah, there you go. There you go. So I'm curing this gentleman of his blindness. And oh, by the way, here's your rules and regulations of the Sabbath. So, and that leads me into the comparative rest, what we're going to see in this chapter, bringing Christ into it. So, in Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So originally it was to give man rest from his works. Once again, what is works? But it's starting to point to Christ, because Christ gives us that permanent rest. And God's Sabbath rest points to our present rest and salvation. And that's what the Jews back, the Old Testament Jews couldn't see or didn't get. All right. So an interesting question that came up in my mind is, so God created man on the 6th day, but he didn't bless that day. So we think we're the epitome of God's creation, but on the 7th day he rested and he sanctified that day. He made that day holy. He didn't make the 6th day holy. So we're kind of being put in our place. So anybody have any thoughts on that? Why he would sanctify his rest and not sanctify the creation of man?
Well, the sixth day he created us, and then he gave us a day to remember what he did for all of us. I mean, that was why it was sanctified, because he created this wonderful world, and at completion, I'm going to give you a day to think about it, and you can be thankful for all the things I've done for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I liked your infusion of his work.
Yeah.
Yeah. God does all the work.
Right.
Right.
Amen.
I think it also shows his grace and his mercy, because he probably didn't actually need to rest on the 7th day, but he did it anyways, right? As not only an example for us, but of hey man, you guys, you're not me, you're gonna need to rest. So
Right.
here's a day for you guys to rest.
And also it comes to mind is here's the glory of creation. Here's your evidence of me that is inherent, and
Right.
to sit back and reflect on what he's done is the beginning of knowledge of God in my.
I like that, John, just showing us an example. If he did it on the 6th day, he was still working, right? So
Right.
did it on the 7th day. He sent Jesus as an example for us to follow and live by, and he showed us an example of how to rest by doing it himself.
And I wonder if the whole idea here, one of the other ideas that God is trying to get across to us, especially as men, is work isn't everything, right? Don't
Yeah.
spend every single day of your life working.
Well, yeah.
It's time, there's time to take a pause and make sure that you are recognizing who is the creator.
As we point towards, I think this is in the pointing to Jesus. Before that is, do you think they had a Sabbath in the garden?
Yeah, that's a good
And
point. And
I doubt it, in my opinion. I mean, just if I were to hazard a guess, but because at that point there was no fall yet, and work was not a pain. It was more probably, and again, this is conjecture, right? It's more of a joy
Yeah.
to work in the garden with God,
Yeah.
because it's all rest. I mean,
What
as
day
you
was the
started to
Sabbath?
allude to earlier, you could do a lot. You could exhaust yourself and consider it restful. If you're, let's say, you like to work out all the time, right? It's absolute peace of mind in some cases, right? So you paint pictures, you write, you do all sorts of creation. But I actually like the grounding that you began earlier in the conversation to focus on God at this time.
You got people like Mark Williams in this world that would work until they died if they weren't able to rest. And so sometimes there's people that need to be instructed to stop and recharge.
Yeah, but
Programmers
Work-
being a big class of those too.
work is a tough definition, because if you're a school teacher, okay, you go to work, and what you do on the weekends is maybe a totally different thing. But if you're a carpenter, then building something with wood would be your work. But for a school teacher, on the weekend, he could be resting in his shop, building things off of wood, and it wouldn't be considered work because his work is school teachers. Okay, but a carpenter, if he's working on the weekend, he's still working. It's just a crazy concept of what work really is. I mean, take a baseball player. Okay, his job is to play baseball. Is he
Yeah.
working on Sunday? He's doing his job.
That's a great analogy. That's one I tried to instill in my son as he rose up the ranks in baseball, and I was like, you'll never work a day in your life if you're just playing baseball.
But
That did,
so Jesus was a carpenter and then he became a teacher. What happens there?
So,
We got a problem.
Nailed to the cross.
ooh,
Christ could have been
Took his
making
punishment.
yeah.
Sorry.
Christ could have been making things on the side during his ministry. We don't know that. Maybe that's the way he rested after a tough sermon.
Well, and
But the interesting thing I think is we all are unique individuals, and we all have individual ways that we rest. And sometimes, working with your hands is rest and relaxation. You can just kind of build something, create something, and other people it's not. Other people it's like, like you say, sit on the couch, don't do anything, close the curtains, turn off the lights, don't let anybody talk to me, that kind of thing. And I think that's important to know is that, I mean, like you said, when you let a culture determine what the Sabbath is, then you wind up with elevators that stop on every floor on Saturday. But if we see that even here in this country, they just keep, changing the rule, moving the rules, and oh, this is wrong, we got to fix this and that and everything else. And I think but it's how the Lord talks to us and how we feel that rest.
So this is all great.
I was going to say, I like how they're in this agrarian society, right? Where you work because you got to plant and do all of the stuff that you need to do in order to eat. And God's saying, but don't do that one day a week. And there's also this aspect of you have to trust that God's going to provide, because you are stopping what you would normally do to make your living. And there's that aspect of it too, which applies to every job. If you are stopping your work, the way you make your money, you have to some degree, put your trust in the Lord, because you're saying, okay, I'm going to do what you told me to do, and you're going to provide for me.
And that is the faith and the belief in God, what you just described, is everything these verses rest upon. It's all of it. So let's jump into
May I?
Sure, no, go ahead.
I mean, but just to see if this is what you're amplifying, it's the strain that the world puts on us, or the strain we have in the world, and to relieve that stress with something like the Sabbath. And the reason why I say the world too is because I don't know if you'd plan to read the other laws. You mentioned some, and then, but we have also the freedom. Everybody will be free of debt. Slaves will be freed. There's a tension in simply living in so many respects, and there's a tension also on creation. The land must rest. Now we look at it these days, it's a wise thing to do to let the farmland rest. They probably even saw it, but the concept is to I really points to the God focus of the day of the Sabbath. You will shed all those things that have you worried and anxious, and you'll focus on me. And let's take some time to enjoy our relationship together.
So can I just add on to what you said, Eric? Because I think there's an interesting tension there between the Sabbath and the rules that the Jews put on the Sabbath, because they've shifted the focus from looking at who the Lord is to make sure you don't break any of these other rules. And so now there's the stress of not breaking these rules that they made, instead of the idea of let's just have the freedom to have some time to spend my time with the Lord however the Lord wants to spend time with me. And they kind of just shifted the focus away from God by adding all of these rules onto it.
And it goes back to the analogy also with playing in the sandbox. We get so busy, we won't turn around and look at our parents. We won't turn around and look at God. We just think that this is what we want to do. Forgive me for going into that different analogy, but it all, to me, it comes together in that.
Yeah.
And they added stress to the day of rest,
Yeah.
because you're being stressed by trying to follow every rule that they made. And it wasn't a day of rest anymore.
And well, there was one Jeremiah comes in. I don't want to jump ahead of you, Tim, too much. If you're going to go in, why they turned to so much. And when we say they, who are we talking about? We're really talking about the intertestamental Jews, because God had all these rules associated with the Sabbath, and then he had, and I like the discussion earlier on define what is near. They had this challenge to what is work, but Jeremiah did say, be careful not to carry a load. And what that word means even is, they were in exile because over and over again, it was the Sabbath that they were being accused of violating. You don't keep my Sabbath. And I think it's what percolated to the top as the representation of their ignoring God. But this is where I go again. I don't blame them. We just went through all this exile, 70 years, and it was clearly, we look at Jeremiah and others, because we broke the Sabbath. Well, we're going to not do that. And they focused heavily on it. So in a lot of ways, I don't blame them for what they did. and missing the point. Because I don't see the explicit expression by the prophets about the relationship of the Sabbath to the heart. I see it in these original ones we wrote, Genesis, Exodus, well, sort of, but once again, which God just said, look, this is for you. This is for you. He didn't really say it that way. And so when they're punished for not observing the literal, the legal aspect, then let alone the 7-year rest, the 7-year freedom, the Jubilee, which none of which they followed. But they're going to say, well, at least we'll get this one right.
Well, and that was one thing I was going to mention. I think is really interesting is they recognize that, and at the same time, we don't have any account of anyone ever following that 7-year rest period of taking the land and not using that land once every 7 years.
And freeing slaves and debt.
Right. So they're like, I can handle the 7-day break, but that whole 7th year, I can't handle it. So I'm going to focus on the 7th day. And I don't know, it's just interesting to me.
So what you guys are talking about is when I go back to what we first started with, that's the main reason why the writer of Hebrews, we talked about the superiority to the angels, to Moses, to the Mosaic Law, and now we're bringing rest. What you guys are talking about, this is the reason why this chapter exists, and why the writer feels that it's important to start this argument and to flow with it. So, this is all
one
good
of the
stuff.
things that I keep going over is that we're right now we're beating up the Jews about all their rules and regulations and everything. And being raised a Catholic, I remember eating a hot dog on Friday and feeling guilty about it. And and even today, it's there are Pentecostal churches where you have to wear a tie, where women wear the veil and the dress and everything. I mean, it's prevalent today, not just back then. They didn't understand. Well, we don't understand either, because we all have our rules in our churches and everything. And we still do. Every church has got rules. I mean,
right.
Just look at our churches that we have today. Somebody comes in, if you look at the movie with about Chuck Smith, the hippies coming in and people were upset about it. They're wearing their ties and everything. So it's let's not get lost on where we are today, because we have the same rules, and we look down upon people when they don't do things the way we think they should do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
we have a habit of. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a great point, John, because I'm sure all of us have examples. I to this day cannot write in a Bible, and because I was taught that you just don't do that. And to this day, I can't underline anything. I can't highlight anything.
Wow. How do you and Sandy get along?
Yeah, exactly. Hers looks like a coloring book. I will transcribe scripture onto other pieces of paper and then do what I need to do. And it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But
that's why you need a digital Bible.
Exactly. Yeah,
stays all nice and clean, and you can write as much as you want.
There you go. But what Sean also said about the way you dress, when I was a child, I always had to be, spit shine and, polished up and a little bow tie. And as I got older, I always had to look nice. And as I progressed and thought, this is not right, but I could never go to church in shorts or wear a baseball cap, which I see, and there's no problem with it. And it's just something that was ingrained in my head. So.
What came to my mind as we're talking about all this overcomplicating things and laws and putting more laws on top of laws, and and it's really interesting when we get to the New Testament and Jesus boils it down to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a spirit behind everything. And I would think the whole law, including the Sabbath law, is wrapped up in those two things as well. And sometimes when you simplify it that way, you start to see, okay, well, we know what God's intention was. It was still to cultivate a heart that believes and trusts in him and that honors him and loves him through the obedience of the law. And when that gets lost, even today, as Sean talked about, ties or veils or anything else that we can put on top of that for one reason or the other, it's important to kind of always go back to that, because in the New Testament, it sheds the light and say, it's about love, guys. It's about loving God. And if that isn't there in any part of the observance of the law or the enforcement of the law or the whatever, even the willingness to obey the law in some sense, because like you said, there are rules, there are laws that are everything, but are they connected as an expression to the love of God within our hearts and wanting to honor and obey him? And I think that's, for me, kind of not, I mean, obviously this is still complicated on a whole different level, but if when we get to that complication, sometimes helpful to come back and just say, is this the God honoring, God loving thing that we ought to be doing? And I think that sometimes answers some of these questions that sometimes gets overcomplicated because we get down the weeds of different ways we can express things. And then, I don't like the way John does it, so I don't think, he's got, or something like that. But yet at the end of the day, that's not going to matter to some degree. And I'm not saying, oh, love is all that matters in that sense, that we can just do whatever, as long as I love God in my heart, who are you to judge me? We're obviously not going down that line. I'm saying just the overcomplication of things. It's what it kind of kept entering my heart is, simplified in the sense that, Lord, whatever that I do to obey you according to your word today, is it connected to loving you with all of my heart and all of my soul and all my strength, and loving one another? Because I think at the end of the day, that's what's going to matter. And that there's a component of faith in that too, right?
Yes.
That enters into that. That we're not just doing this because of whatever reason. We believe God's word is true, and all of this is connected to loving him in some way. And even though we don't understand fully why it may matter, and one day we do this versus we do that, but yet this is the God honoring thing. And as we continue to study, that motivation and that heart matters to God. That it's centered on loving him and honoring him. It's kind of what I thought about as we're kind of contemplating a lot of this stuff, which is great.
Yeah, no, that's great points, Rich. So I promised myself I'd at least do one verse. So it looks like we have time for just
I wanted to go
verse.
back to your slides. What was the second?
We can if you like.
Yeah, what was the second rest
word
in Greek?
Let me see if I can find it. I think I might have.
Oh, never mind.
No. Let me. Let's see.
We'll be on this subject next week, obviously. So,
verses 1, 3, 5, 10, and 11 is katapausis, and it's the heavenly blessedness in which God dwells, and it's the promise of persevering believers in Christ, that there's rest after their toils and trials. The second one was katapau, and that's to make quiet, to cease, to still or restrain, or lead to a quiet place. And you can see how that plays into God was leading them to the promised land of Canaan, and that was there. He was leading them to the quiet place, and he was trying to make them still and to restrain. I don't know if that helps or.
No. I just didn't capture the word.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So let's see. Let's try to get just one. Therefore, verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest, there's that word, still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. So we've kind of really already torn a lot of chapter 4 apart here. This verse starts off with therefore, so it's looking back to chapter 3 and verse 19, which was talking about the ancient Israelites couldn't enter their rest because of their unbelief. And so there was a whole generation that didn't get into the promised land because of their unbelief. And it's interesting to note in Hebrews 3:11, it's the first mention of my rest or God's rest. And then we're talking once again about his rest. And let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of us. So the ancient Israelites were expecting the promised land to be their rest. That they didn't get the spiritual aspect of it. They were expecting, once I get into Canaan, then I will rest. And God's viewpoint, this was just a shadow of his promised rest, and his real rest was to come. And we'll see that as we get through the verses.
I wonder what their expectation was of real rest. Did that mean they went into the land of Canaan and then never had to do any work at all?
So that's a great question, because God promised them a land of milk and honey, and he promised them that the infrastructure of society would already be built. They would live off of wells that had already been dug. They would live off the food that had already been planted. It was a pre-existing abundance. So they did not have to pioneer this land. So I mean, I think if somebody told me, "Hey Tim, I'm going to give you a house, and there's a housekeeper and there's a guy in the back take care of your lawn and everything," I would think, "Hey, I can rest. I don't have to do anything." So just from the human, once again, it's the fleshly aspect. I would think everything would be provided, and I wouldn't have to do much. I could go off and do some of the things that I enjoy. But once again, that's the fleshly part of us thinking. We're not thinking of a spiritual rest at this point. And I think Eric brought up, or other people brought up, we're kind of beating up on the Jews here, but we all would think that. If God said, "Hey, you can go in and you don't have to plant, you don't have to dig, you don't have to do this because I'm taking care of you," we would think, "Oh, great, I can sit back and watch TV." But that's not the rest that he was ultimately trying to open their eyes to.
Yeah, because I think even now we have this promise of rest, and we get this idea that when we go into heaven, do we have this idea that when we get to heaven, we're not
Yeah.
going to do anything?
Right.
I don't think that that's correct either, right?
Mm-mm.
He's promising us rest. He's promising us he'll provide, but that doesn't mean you get to sit around on the couch all day and do nothing. And that also, after a while, that's going to be hard to do.
That's why I
Right.
go
And we
back to
could,
the garden. I mean,
right. That's a great point,
Yeah,
Eric.
yeah.
And we could probably go around to this whole group. What do you think you're going to be doing in heaven? And all of our answers would be different, probably based upon our personalities and what we do. And I'll go out on a limb. I think we might all be wrong. We're what we think we're going to
I
be doing.
guarantee I am.
Yes, I have always joked, because I love to snow ski. Snow ski has been part of my life, that when I get up there, I'm going to be, I'll be handed a pair of skis, and I'm going to be skiing with Christ and Paul.
That's a long hill down.
I know, but
Heading
the
back.
snow would be perfect. It would be 90 degrees out. We'd be in shorts, and we wouldn't get cold.
Yep,
So,
and you'd be
that's
shoveling snow for a long time.
and Sean, that's probably what would actually be happening, because God is like, "Hey, you think you're just going to be kicking back? No, you go shovel this pathway." And you know what? Now in later in my life, I'm okay with that. I give me a broom, God. That's I would be fine with
Amen.
that.
You're gonna love it. Go
Yeah.
shovel that parking lot. You're gonna love it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing in heaven. I don't
One-
care what I'm doing. I'm gonna
One of
love
the
it.
things
I'm just
I
gonna
really
be standing
like-
around with my mouth wide open going, ah.
Right.
Those are the ones standing by the cooler. Hey,
What
let's
I-
just
what I
glorify
really-
God here. Yeah.
What I really
That's
like is that you said you'll have a spiritual rest. And I really think that that's where we as human beings, when I know for myself, when I wasn't a Christian, that my spirit was not at rest because God was calling me, but I was running the other way. And my spirit was trying to fill that void with all the other stuff of this world. And I really think that that's the rest that God's talking about, is resting in him, and our spirit will be rested. And it's not about the physical stuff that we do, it's
Right.
the spiritual aspect of it. Is he sanctified that day to make it holy, so that our spirit could rest. And what we do other than that, it doesn't matter. It's
That's kind of
about our spirit resting in him.
that's kind of the rest they got when they went and it was move-in ready, because they didn't have to worry
Right.
about the years it would take to grow everything. They could just go, hey, thanks God, and rest in him and give him thanks for providing.
Right.
But there was still work, right? Because they had to kick the people out.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I
And-
think
and
that's where,
God did.
that's,
They just had to help.
that's where
That's
the
true.
problem.
That's true. But they stopped, right? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that's where the problem lies. It's not so much the expectation of the rest that was to come. It was the prerequisite, if you will, by faith, enter. Because if you read Joshua 1, right? I mean, it's clear, go and enter, I've given it to you. But the command was be strong and be of great courage. Because what you're gonna face in that entering requires a belief, a steadfast belief that I'm gonna not only provide for when you get in, but before you get in, the manner in which you're gonna get in, which is going to be scary at times. And that's the thing that I think, we stumble at times, because it's the process of entering into that rest, and connected to what we really believe about what God is doing. Because clearly, they're going to waver more than a few times. Are we sure we're supposed to do this, even though God said it? Even the commandments were clear, even though, and that's the weakness of the flesh that, and we're going to explore that, I know, as we get into Hebrews 4. So let us be careful, let us fear, the other translation, that's a pretty strong word, more than
Right.
just careful.
And so I fell short of my goal here. I got through a half a verse because the next part of this, and Rich just alluded to it, there's a warning here. So we probably should look at that. I don't think we have time. We just have a minute. So I guess we'll stop right there. And this has been interesting. I have to tell you, this study for me on rest has been not restful. I've had to reevaluate things, and I kept thinking about my own experiences on rest and how I viewed it, and just putting this together was interesting. So, but this is great information regarding Sabbath and how everybody thinks about it. So, all right, who would like to close in prayer?